So we're in our third lesson on Matthew. We'll be in chapter 3 and 4 today. We'll cover the first part of chapter 4. I'm going to be in 3 and 4. So one of the things, just as a quick catch up of what's going on, we talked about how the Gospel of Matthew and all the Gospels, but we're studying Matthew in particular, isn't intended to be the written equivalent of a video movie of Jesus' life, right? That's not how biographies work, right? What happens instead is the person who's writing the biography picks out things that they want to emphasize, and therefore also has to omit things that aren't as important to the story they're trying to tell. And that's not a bad thing. Sometimes we think in today's, the way we think about biographies, well, we should know every little thing. That's an incorrect expectation. It's like if you tell a story about somebody you care about to introduce them to somebody else, you don't tell them everything. You pick out things to emphasize parts. And as I've consistently said, I will talk about it in the context of the human person, Matthew, writing the gospel. I'm not in any way, shape, or fashion denying that the Holy Spirit worked through Matthew. Okay? But he used Matthew. And I don't ascribe to the idea that when these things were written, that Matthew's like in some kind of trance and he's just kind of sitting. I don't believe that's how it works. It doesn't read that way for sure. That's my personal opinion. I don't know what you guys think, but I just have found it much more useful to be able to connect to the Scripture, knowing that as I've seen God work through regular folk in normal ways, it helps me to sort of say, oh, this is kind of similar how he worked with Matthew, right? So Matthew had a way of thinking about things, had a way of wanting to tell the story of Jesus. He wasn't the only one, right? And we know from the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, he starts off saying very clearly, I know a bunch of other people have told the story, but I'm going to give you my version based on my experience and my research. So from that perspective, just be aware of that. Don't ever say that, right? And so there are a lot of people who don't think about their Bible very carefully, and they have these wrong conceptions about what's going on. So then, if Matthew tells a series of stories out of order or in a different place than, say, Mark does or Luke does, and that creates a bunch of unnecessary stress, right? They don't have to be perfect like that, because they're telling the story from their point of view. They're organizing the information, not always chronologically. We assume that. As a matter of fact, I used to think that reading my Bible. I used to think, literally, before I, did much study of the Bible, that literally it was written in order, and that's absolutely not true. Not true of the Bible itself. Not even true of all the Gospels. You can find things that are in different orders in different Gospels. That is not an error. That is a deliberate choice. Because thematically, it may make sense to take something that occurred later that kind of dealt with a particular issue and put it closer to something else in the Gospel, for example. So that's not an error. People throw those things up as an error all the time. I just kind of laugh like you have a wrong assumption about how the Bible should work. And it's your assumption about how the Bible should work. I'm pretty sure if you go read the rest of it, like the entire thing, you'll see this stuff occur all the time, because that's the way they make points. So anyways, just real quick, I wanted to kind of, Matthew starts off with chapter 1, his genealogy, and it's his origin story, and his birth, right? And we know from the get-go, the way Matthew introduces it, is he's trying to sort of set up both a comparison and a continuation. So the comparison is Adam, Israel, and then Jesus. I mean, there's a little bit more depth to that, but just think about it that way. Because what does he say in the first verse? He literally says, this is the genesis of the one we'll call Jesus. And then he connects him to Abraham and David, right? And you think, well, why David? Well, David is the one who is the representative king, right? Which is one of the things that Matthew's going to tell us here shortly is the kingdom is near, and there's a kingdom, there has to be a king. And Matthew's point is Jesus is the king of that kingdom. So he structured it that way. But it's really a story of Adam, Israel, and Jesus, right? And Jesus is both contrasted with Adam and Israel, but he's also portrayed as the continuation of the fulfillment of that story. Now, I've told you guys, if you go read the last prophet of the Bible chronologically, Malachi, I mean, you would kind of think like this would be sort of the end of it. Like, okay, so we've checked all the boxes, the story completes. But you go read that last the whole thing, I think it's only 4 or 5 chapters, but definitely the last 2 chapters, there's nothing that feels like completion or things ending. Or if you want to go read the end of the historical books of the Old Testament, those things end in the same way, right? You have Ezra and Nehemiah at the back, and you're sort of like, okay, but it doesn't feel like it's completed. Like you need to build the city, to build the temple, but nothing's like it was before. Definitely nothing like God promised. And so you're left with this, like a cliffhanger, right? And so the Gospels in part are trying to connect you to that and say, no, this is how the story fits. This is how the story ends, right? So I want you guys to get that. And I did just real quick last time. It felt a bit rushed. I just want to reiterate. If you go read the Old Testament quotations, like in this case we're looking at chapter 2, that Matthew uses, the stories don't, it seems a little bit confusing because you would think when, I think the easiest one to kind of talk about is the one from Hosea 11, right? Talking about how Jesus is born. Herod has been kind of tricked by the wise men. They kind of go off back home. And he then begins to commit genocide in Bethlehem. And then there's a quotation from Hosea 11. And when you kind of read that, it does say, out of Egypt call my son, and all. It says that's true from that perspective. But if you go look at the story in Hosea, the whole chapter that Matthew quotes from is not about just, the Messiah is going to come from Egypt. The whole story in Hosea 11 is something completely different, right? It is about a son that was not faithful, who worshipped other gods, who then, right, who doesn't realize that it was Yahweh, God, that got them out of Egypt, that grew them into a nation, right? They've forgotten God. That's the story of Hosea 11. So it's an odd place in the Bible to be quoting from, to be talking about Jesus, except for, if you understand how Matthew's starting to do it, he's setting up a comparison between Israel and Jesus. And his point is, Israel's story, they fail in their vocation, but Jesus does not. That's the short version of that. Okay, that's why it works that way. So when you read it, if you did what I said to the other ones, you're kind of scratching your head. How does that doesn't seem right. And it's because we come to the text with an incorrect assumption that all the Old Testament prophets are sitting there and they're actually seeing Jesus and they're writing stuff down that is describing that, but they're doing it in their time. And that's not how it works. I mean, there are cases where the Bible works with it, don't get me wrong. But I'm just saying it doesn't always work that way, and that's not a good model to have, right? You should always be thinking about Old Testament stuff has a local, contextual meaning. They could have a more prophetic meaning for sure. So I'm not taking that away. I'm just saying do not think of Hosea sitting there, well, I'm actually looking at this event of Jesus 600 years beyond me, but I'm going to write it here in this context for this particular thing I'm talking about. That's not likely what's going on. It's probably actually the reverse, where God sort of in control of the whole story is leveraging Hosea to talk prophetically to represent him and his people in a way that also can then be used later. You see what I'm saying? There's a difference there. And I get very frustrated because I remember experiencing this as a much younger Christian, of being frustrated when learning that the Bible didn't work the way I thought it ought to with the prophecy stuff. That was really, for me, kind of a bummer. Now I really appreciate it a lot more because I do see it as one complete story, not really two different stories in one. Anyways, so for today, just to kind of just briefly catch you up. So we just came out of where Matthew was comparing Israel and Jesus. So they both go to Egypt, right? They both encounter genocide, right? They both have an oppressive king. They both come out of Egypt, right? And so that's kind of where we are in the part, and we're going to go to chapter 3, which is an introduction of John the Baptist. And this whole event, there's so many ways we can take it, but I think for now, what we need to do is just sort of kind of hit the highlights of what the story says. And just remember that Matthew is still connecting and telling the story of Jesus, because this is an origin story so far. Right? We're basically getting, hey, Jesus is the Messiah. Here's his miraculous birth. I'm going to then Charlie compares with Israel. Part of that comparison involves this event that is linked to the Exodus, the baptism of Jesus. And then I'm going to authenticate all that in chapter 4 with this test that Jesus goes through. And then you have the launch of Jesus' ministry. See what I'm saying? So the first, 4.5 chapters of Matthew are an origin story meant to sort of introduce the big idea, and then you're going to get into the specific stuff where Jesus begins to do things and teach things. Okay? So that's where we are in the Gospel of Matthew. So in Matthew 3, I want you to sort of take note, because you guys know that John the Baptist is out in the wilderness of Jordan, right? The Jordan River, outside of like Jericho and all that kind of stuff. He's baptizing. Okay? Baptism. What was he calling people to do? What was his, if you look at verse 2, the open book quiz, look at verse 2. What is the story, or what is it John the Baptist is saying? Matthew chapter 3, verse 2. What is he saying? There's only a handful of words there, so you can't get this wrong unless you pick it like a preposition or something like that. So, up against somebody, anybody?
Repent.
Okay. Why? Why should I repent?
Because the kingdom of heaven is at hand.
Boom. Think about this for a second. So this is where you've got to know the story, okay? That phrase, kingdom of heaven, doesn't mean a whole lot to people. So I'm going to break it down for you. Have you ever heard, and I am not about to get into a political discussion, okay? So I'm not going there, but here's an example. Have you ever heard the phrase like, Washington issued a statement, or Washington did this, all right? And what they mean, they're talking about the place, the capital of our country. But what they really mean is the government has done X, or the government issued a statement. So it's a way of using a place name, a toponym, if you want to sound really smart people, toponym is a place name, to represent a person or a group of people. Okay? We do this all the time, right? I mean, I don't know. I'm trying to think that you guys can probably think a better example than me, but anyway, you get the idea. I can't think of a drawing blank. Washington was all I had. You understand, right? I need some kind of so that heaven doesn't mean like there's this place that's in charge. It's really meaning the realm of God is in charge. Therefore, what that phrase really means is His kingdom is here. So if it's near to you, it's basically here, both in time, temporally, and in space, locally. What he's saying is it is here. It's beginning right here, and obviously the idea is to be linking this to Jesus. The kingdom of heaven is at hand, is here, because we're about to talk some more about Jesus. Okay. Now, just real quick, the baptism part. This is kind of a deep subject, but let me give you sort of the shorter version. It's kind of working knowledge that I think is sufficient, which is, what is an Old Testament story that involves water, that involves a rescue of people that we've already talked about? Like in the story of Matthew, say it. Yes, the Exodus event, right? Think about this, okay? So think about this for a second. Where is John the Baptist? What does Matthew tells us, right? He's baptizing in the river Jordan. Mm-hmm. What river did Israel have to cross to get to the promised land and live as a nation with God as their king? Not the Mississippi. Not the Mississippi. What river?
Jordan.
Thank you. I try to make it easy, man. But you guys got to participate, right? Not the Jordan River. So the whole story, what John the Baptist is calling people to do is to remember the whole story of the Exodus, which involves God pulling them out of Egypt, right? Creating them as a people and giving them the promised land in the context of His covenant. Y'all with me? That's all you have to know. That's what the baptism sort of represents. And He's calling people back to that story and that reality, because people have gone off, right? And they're away from it, right? Now, there's another part of this, right? The Jordan was sort of like the boundary into the promised land, right? Where Israel was going to live with God as their king, right? And literally, they had God's presence right there in the tabernacle. They'd eventually turn to the temple, but you know what I'm saying? That was the model. And then their job, if if you guys remember carefully, is to be a kingdom of priests. And that doesn't mean internally focused priests where they just sort of go tend the temple. That meant they were supposed to be a kingdom of priests to the rest of the nations. In other words, their job, their reason for living was to go introduce to the rest of the world their God, right? And by this way, they are fulfilling their part of the bigger promise where it says, God says that I'm going to bless the whole world and the nations through this family of Abraham, of whom Israel is. Y'all see how this works? It's not hard. I mean, you sort of got to hear it a few times, but you can connect this very Adam and Abraham and Israel. I mean, it just kind of flows. It's all one promise, and it's God working it out, right, in progressive fashion. And so this is what John the Baptist is doing, right? This is what John the Baptist is. He's there. And I want you to look at verse 7. This is so important. Who is there?
Pharisees.
Pharisees and Sadducees, basically the religious leadership in and around Jerusalem at that time. Okay? And John is trying to get them to understand that this kingdom is not the way you guys think it is. Right? And he sort of announces a judgment against them. Right? And this is so important, this verse 9. So if you understand what I just told you the story, that God chooses a Mesopotamian man named Abram to build a family out of. And everything else from that point, from Genesis 12 in the Bible forward, and all the Hebrew scriptures, is anchored in the identity within Abraham. It's a tribal family identity. Understand? Very important. Right? So when John then says to them, right, hey, if you think it's enough, verse 9, John the Baptist says, if you think it's enough to be a descendant of Abraham, no, that's not what's going on. And he says something crazy. He says, God is able to raise of these stones and make them his children of equal value to the real descendants of Abraham. You see what I'm saying? This would be like, kind of cuts at the core of their identity. Okay? I mean, it's like one of those things where he's gone to the root of things. Right? And his point is this. You guys are missing it. You guys are missing something fundamental about the whole thing. And so he's trying to call them back. And then he then says, I'm about to introduce, I know there's somebody coming, right? But I don't know exactly who yet, right? But somebody's coming that I'm not worthy to baptize. Right? And so then we know how this happens. Jesus says, baptize me. John says, I'm not worthy to do that. Jesus says, do it anyways because we need to do this, right? I want you to understand verse 16 and 17. Matthew 3, 16 and 17. This is so important. So think about, if Matthew is telling you a story about who Jesus is, and he's already told you about this miraculous birth, and he's then sort of laid the groundwork of Jesus is reliving the story of Israel, but making all the right choices and living the true way, right? And then you get to this point, and then so Matthew then just wants to make it absolutely positively clear what's going on here. He says, this event occurs. And Jesus, when he was baptized, went straightway out of the water, right? So he's going into the water, and now he's out, dripping wet, right? Standing there in the middle of the Jordan. And something miraculous happens. The heavens opened and saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and lighting upon him. That's about as good as you can get from a description from an ancient Near Eastern about what occurred, right? And then he says, you hear this voice, right? A voice from heaven saying, this is what? This is my beloved Son. Catch this. My beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Now, if you stop for just a second, I want you to understand something. In the story of Matthew, he's comparing Israel. Israel is also called God's son. As a matter of fact, when Moses goes to Pharaoh in Exodus chapter 4 and says, hey, let my people go, he actually says that God wants his son to be let go. Okay? All right? And then some of the other quotations we just have in Matthew falls, my son shall be called out of Egypt, etc. Right? You understand? So this comparison is still going on, and it's clear that Matthew's trying to get everybody to understand that the Son of God, that the true Son, is here before you. Right? And he's just gone through every one of the events of Israel's history, but he's lived them in a way that was following the Father and not making the choices that Israel made. So turn me to chapter 4. You guys know the story. This is in Matthew chapter 4. This is the temptation trial of Jesus in the wilderness. Now I need you guys to sort of pick up on this piece of it. First of all, the wilderness is a dangerous place. Right? The wilderness is not a place that you're going to go and hang out and live. There are people, groups of people who can live on the fringe of it and survive, but it's not a place where you're not going to go live for a very long time. It's a desert. It's a desert with all these canyons and stuff, and it's a very dangerous place. Context for just a second. The wilderness in general, if you guys remember the stories, outside of Eden was the wilderness. It was a dangerous place, right? Cain was scared to go there. Outside of the camp, when Israel is wandering in the desert, the wilderness, outside of their camp, dangerous space. They didn't want to be there because God was in the midst of their camp. That was his sacred ground. But out there is danger. And you don't go out there unless God's leading you out. Right? That's kind of the idea. There's a lot more deeper to that to maybe talk about at another time, but just sort of get that's the context of what the wilderness means. Jesus goes to a place. Now remember, I told you I'm going to talk about Jesus in a way that probably emphasizes his humanity. Not attempting to explain to you something that's impossible to talk about how he's also God at the same time. I can't do that well. So when I talk about this, just understand, Jesus was a human being, and when he went out there, this was danger for him. It was uncomfortable, he was tired, he was hungry, he was thirsty. All the things you would experience, the pain, everything, the isolation, the fear, he went through out there, okay? It's very important to get that. Because what's going to happen matters greatly, okay? So real quickly, verse 1, Matthew chapter 4. Who takes him out there?
The Spirit.
Very important to understand, he wasn't driven out there by the devil. The Spirit takes him there, takes him to a place of danger. Right? What's the word tempted? Let me just offer this up to you. Don't think like moral temptation only. It's the better way to think about it. The better word in general is to test something, to reveal its nature. The way you test, like why do you have tests in school, in college? To
learn.
Well, to prove that you learned. I mean, let's say Ashley could say, yep, I learned about biology, right? But I'm pretty sure the professor goes, well, I mean, I believe that, but let's just have a test to make sure.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? So in other words, the tests it doesn't have to be with the intent to be negative. It's the intent to reveal, okay? The events we're about to read about parallel the Israel story in Exodus, okay? And what happened in the Israel story in the Exodus is Israel goes through the desert, the wilderness, and within 3 days, they're hungry and thirsty, they start to plant. And then God gives them water. They actually sort of test God. I mean, that's a lot of stuff to explain. They kind of test God at the waters of Meribah. And Moses strikes the rock, the Lord comes out, all is good, etc. But the point is, they were not trusting. At that point in time, they were literally saying, let's stone Moses and go back to Egypt. He's right here, or we're all going to die. And then this happens multiple times. But the big one that comes to my mind is when they're in Kadesh Barnea. They spend the spies out to look at the land. They all come back. Joshua and Caleb say, hey, it's a good deal. 10 of the spies say, not such a good deal. At that point in time, the promised land, the whole entire covenant that they're part of at Sinai, the whole thing it's just got one thing at the crux of the whole matter. Trust God. Trust the one who's already good. There's all the covenant rules and all that kind of stuff. to the God of Israel, whose name was revealed as Yahweh, was the thing. And every point along the way, if they would just do that, things would be fine. You know this because Matthew's story. Jesus, every point along the way, is going to be doing this. Is to trust God. And almost every time they fail. Right? Such that they wind up wandering in the desert how long?
40 years.
40 years. How long is Jesus in the desert? 40 days. Right? So not quite the same, but obviously there's a parallel going on. And so Jesus is about to go through a very real event, okay? Like a historical event that occurred, that Matthew is explaining as Jesus parallel going through the Exodus story of Israel, but making all the right choices. Living it the way Israel was intended to live. You see what I'm saying? Okay? So, there's a tempter. He's called Diablos, the devil. There's a whole rabbit trail of talking about that we could go down. I think for now, let's just say a personal being. I say personal in that it speaks to Jesus sort of as a person who had no religion. It's an event where Jesus is encountering, obviously, a spiritual being, not of himself, and then there's this dialogue with her. So it's a personal, it's not generic evil. It's not just danger or something like that, okay? It's evil with intent, right? And so here's how it works, okay? First question, verses 3 and 4, okay? What is the question that's asked? Read it. Tell me, what's going on? Matthew's trying to tell you who Jesus is. It's an incredible claim that he's the Son of God. And he's saying God's Spirit, or God himself, drove him out into this dangerous place where he will die. People don't live out in the middle of this desert and live forever, okay? He's in a dangerous spot. And what's the question? What's the question that's embedded in verse 3?
If your God makes stones
No.
food, if you're the Son of God.
Right. What is the question assumed there? Are you really the Son of God? Are you sure about this? Okay. This is one of those things you sort of got to get, okay? We always sort of imagine in our heads, sort of Superman, spiritual Jesus out there trying to convince or trying to prove to the devil that he's the Son of God. The devil doesn't know. The devil obviously knows. He leads the question with, if you're the Son of God. Quite likely was present at Jesus' baptism, was aware of it. Okay, you understand what I'm saying? So it's not like the devil's out there not sure, right? Okay? So we always tell the story that it's wrong. Jesus has just gone through this event, 30 to 33 years old, grown man, been a grown man for a while. Think about this just from, and again, this is where we had to kind of wrestle with the Trinity thing, so we're going to do the best we can. But I just want to look at this from the perspective of, as Jesus grew, we know from Hebrews, Jesus matured, and we know from the story of Matthew, he grew more like a human does. He started as a zygote, was born as a baby, grew up, etc. So he fell down his skin, in other words, he lived a normal human life. At what point in our life does someone come to the place or the realization that they are the Son of God? Like if we think to ourselves, Jesus really the whole time he's alive, walking around kind of hiding the secret. I'm God. I'm not telling anybody right now I'm God. And if we want to go out and have a race, we're going to win every time. Or if we want to see who's the strongest person, we're out there and I'm going to, you know what I'm saying? That is not even a real human experience, in my opinion, to be able to. So this is my opinion, you have yours, but I don't think it was like that. And I think this moment in the story, because Israel wrestled with who they were. I mean, they wanted to claim to be the son by descendant, but they didn't want to, fulfill the vocation, right? I think in this thing, that what the devil's trying to do to Jesus is get him to doubt the reality of who he is, right? Okay, and so that requires some challenging thoughts about how it is to be God and man at the same time. But just go with me with kind of a human emphasis for a second, okay? Just let me have that so we can have this conversation. Imagine coming to a place where Jesus begins to realize, after a long period of time walking with the Father, that he is the true Son. right? That's probably, maybe it was one day, whatever, but maybe not. It certainly is probably something he would wrestle with. Like, am I just deluding myself? Like, am I crazy? What's that? You know what I mean? So think about now why the question that the devil's asking Jesus is so powerful. Because he's playing on the doubt that could be there in Jesus. Okay? The doubt that could be there. So the devil's trying to get Jesus. The devil probably understands what's going on. And he's trying to get Jesus to doubt. Are you the Son of God you're out here in the desert? It's a dangerous place. I know, man, you must be tired. You must be hungry. If you're the Son of God, how could your Father do this to you? Where is your Father right now, Jesus? You're out here about to die of starvation, dehydration. Are you the Son of God, really? Oh, if you are, he's from the stones and the bread. Fix your circumstances your way. Right? Now, what Jesus does next is so important. It's not that he quoted scripture. It's what he quotes. Jesus understands where he is in the overall story of everything. Okay? Again, imagine it just from a human perspective. He is aware that he has been sort of, at this point, he's living through the moments that Israel lived and failed. And so what does he quote? Everybody knows the quote, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. Where is that from? Anybody got any notes there? It's from Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy is the last of the 5 books of the Torah. So that's a very big important thing right there. This is sort of right before they go on with Joshua and the Promised Land. Okay? If you look at the whole thing, okay, of Deuteronomy chapter 8, it's a warning Moses is giving, right? And he says there in verse 3, this is the Deuteronomy quote, and he humbled thee, and suffered thee to hunger, allowed you to hunger, and fed thee with manna. So this is Moses retelling what Israel had just gone through for the last 40 years, okay? So he's telling the Israelites this story. This is what Jesus chooses to quote from, right? He fed thee with manna which thou knewest not, you know where it came from. Neither did thy fathers know, so nobody knew that these were the stuff came from. That he might take thee, right, might make thee know that, what? Man doth not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. Right? So think about that quote. Moses is telling Israel, hey, you guys had to go through the desert. You had to go through hunger. Right? And then God miraculously supplied you with food to live all that time. And so Jesus then quotes this back. Not to say that, well, I'm just out here in the desert and I'm out here studying the scripture or something. That's going to sustain. That's not his point. His point is, I know where I am in the story. And I know that as the son, right, just as the son of Israel was cared for in the place where God had taken them out of Egypt in the wilderness, I am in the wilderness. God brought me here. My Father brought me here. And he will take care of me. Right? You see what he's saying? Very important. So it's the moment where Jesus, remember how we had the conversation about the Tree of Life series? And I told you that the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The tree of knowledge of good and evil, oftentimes it makes a lot of common sense. It makes logical sense. And the tree of life sometimes looks dangerous. In this moment, it's as if Jesus is standing in front of the tree of life. And it's dangerous to remain there. It's dangerous just to trust you're going to somehow be sustained in the wilderness. It's logical to say, if I could make some bread, I should make it. You understand? But in that choice, Jesus is recognizing that I would have to then, therefore, choose against what my Father did, which is bring me out here anyways. Okay? Y'all with me? Is it making sense? Very important. We're going to end here. We're going to pick this up next time with the second temptation. Right? But I want you to, because all three of these kind of fit together to make a point. The punchline obviously is Jesus is the true Son, the faithful Son to the faithful Father. But I want y'all read the rest of it. Go read the rest of chapter 4, or at least the temptation part of chapter 4. And I want you to read the quotes that Jesus does. Okay? Go read like the chapter that those quotes are in. And then ask yourself, why did he quote from there? And I want you also, when the devil quotes from the Old Testament, a psalm, go read that psalm. And ask yourself, why would Satan choose that psalm? Okay? Just do the exercise for me. We'll come back next week and talk about it. Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you so much for allowing us to study your word. Help us to remember we are a part of your story as well. Help us to follow your Son and making the choices and living the life that glorifies you. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Mhm.